Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about recommended steps boards can take in this current disruptive environment. And joining me is Amy Simmerman, who's a partner with Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and is one of our legal and governance experts, which with a special finger on the pulse of the Court of Chancery there in Delaware. So, Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, we wanted to talk about sort of this, board duties and all the new things that have sort of entered the fray here. And so, what are some of the important board issues to consider related to overseeing one's fiduciary duties in this environment? And why are they especially important now?
So I don't think this will be news to anyone listening, but it's worth going over to kind of set the stage. There are a lot of pressures coming to bear on boards of directors right now. And I think part of what we want to do today is talk about how to keep them manageable and think about them. But right now, there are all these pressures on boards. And just to tick them off, some of them are longstanding and familiar. Some of them are pretty new to the current environment, but you've always got your Delaware law-based fiduciary duties as a board and the risk of stockholder litigation. As for how they're playing out right now, I think some big areas of activity we see relate to a board's oversight obligations to ensure that a board is responsibly overseeing the running of the company, ensuring that the company complies with the law. There's a lot of attention on that right now, which dovetails with exactly what we're talking about today. There's been continued focus on conflicts of interest in the boardroom, so you've got to be mindful of those. But then far beyond your Delaware law-based fiduciary duties, we see that boards have always had to think about financial controls and disclosures and the responsibilities of audit committees. That's nothing new. The topics that we're really starting to see come to the fore lately are things like cyber issues, regulatory issues. They've been there for a while, but they're continuing to be very important. Of course, COVID-19 and all the issues that presents and the focus on employees and safety. ESG and corporate purpose, that's obviously a big, sharp area of concern. We're seeing continual activity and focus on it, including from investors, potentially out of the SEC. We're waiting to see more on that. Touched on employee considerations already. That's obviously a big one and part of ESG. Then you've got tone at the top and culture and diversity. Diversity is obviously a big one. We've got the California law for companies in California. We've also got various disclosure rules and possibilities coming out of NASDAQ and the states. And then on top of all of that, of course, we've got pressures from investors, proxy advisory firms, activists sometimes. So these are all the things you need to think about as a board member.
There's no question. I mean, I just think about just returning to work and the issues, whether it's design of the offices or the well-being of customers and employees. I mean, it's just directors are certainly earning their money these days. Let's look at the advice. Let's look at some advice that we might offer. And what are some of the concrete steps that boards and management should consider to ensure that prudent oversight of their business and legal duties is happening?
Exactly. We've got these swirl of things that we just went through, but we want to keep it manageable for boards, and we can, right? And that's what we want to talk about now is concrete steps that boards can take. And so there are a number of things I would go through. First one is for boards to have opportunities to be reminded of their fiduciary duties and how corporate governance is really supposed to work. Because I think if you have that reset conversation with your counsel and management, it can help keep these things manageable and stay grounded. So make sure you're having those. And the next thing I would mention is board members, to deal with all of this, of course, need to be active and engaged and meet and receive updates as needed. Being engaged is a big part of taking these things head on. I think just in one of the recent programs that you had, PwC was on and mentioned that members of management, when they're polled in surveys, are saying we want board members to be even more engaged. And so this is a big part of it, is digging in and taking these issues head on. Some question that comes up pretty frequently lately is there's a lot coming at boards. We have our standing board meetings. We have our standing board committees like audit and governance and comp. Do we need other board committees to be on top of these things? And I would say it's a know it when you see it, know it when you feel it kind of thing. There are no hard and fast rules, but if you're finding that your standing board meetings and the occasional special board meeting are not enough, you might need a committee to be on top of some of these issues, whether it's a particular risk or compliance issue at the company or return to work or something like that. But you only need to go down that path of having a special board committee if you're really feeling the need for it. Another step for board members to keep in mind is when you have conversations among the board and advisors and management, the board needs to understand all those issues we touched on. They need to be working with their advisors to understand the relevant legal and business issues. But keep in mind, and this ought to actually be a source of comfort for the board, you're sitting as a board member atop the company, right? Management still runs the day-to-day business of the company. Board members actually don't even want to be down in the weeds, right? That increases their exposure, that increases the risk of confusion and roles at the company. So part of what you have to remember as board members, you do have all these things coming at you, but you are fundamentally sitting atop the company. And so you need to have meetings and conversations with management and advisors that give you comfort that you understand the issues. You want to understand who's responsible for what within the company. You want to ensure that proper follow-up occurs and that if you identify an issue, someone comes back to the board at some future meeting and ties up the loose ends on that issue. But fundamentally, the board is not responsible for running the company on a day-to-day basis. And so I think if you keep those lines of obligation in mind, it can help a board say, aha, here's my role in addressing those issues we discussed. A couple more things I would touch on. A board wants to be comfortable that management is on top of the issues and that there are proper lines of responsibility within the company to ensure that issues are being addressed and that the company is being well run and run responsibly. That's a big part of how the board can carry out these issues and maintain its proper role as a board. The final thing I would touch on is your board record. And so we want to think about things like your minutes, making sure that your board minutes accurately reflect that the board is doing these things and that systems are in place and proper follow-up is coming to the board. You also want to think as board members about your board books. Are they being given to you in a way that is digestible? Obviously, board members get a ton of information. We can only limit that so much. But board members can have a dialogue with management and their advisors about whether they need to receive information in a bit of a different way or whether they need their materials to be curated a little bit differently. And the other thing that you want to have in mind as board members, be comfortable that you're getting materials far enough in advance so that you can stay on top of all the types of issues that we talked about and have time to digest them. Obviously, some things happen last minute. If you're doing a transaction and documents don't get done till the last minute, that's one thing. But if you're in a place where sometimes you're not getting your materials far enough in advance to come and be prepared and deal with all these issues, you can have that dialogue with management and your advisor.
So, Amy, as you're ticking off all these issues and steps that somebody that a corporate board can take, I can't help every time you tick something off to think about the importance of board leadership. And I'm certainly not a proponent of what I'll call an imperial outside chairman or an imperial lead director. But in a lot of these issues, it does take leadership at the board level, which happens from an individual, or at least a group of individuals, but more typically there's somebody that is spending the time to think through or helping, point the board in a proper direction. Now, if the board doesn't do it, that falls typically, and we've seen this on the CEO. But I think boards are much better when that's done at the board level and not done by a CEO. So my advice would be give great thought to who is, going to be assuming those roles, because particularly in a time like this, it seems to me to be very important. So
I think that's exactly right. And we started off by going through all the issues boards are facing. We also talked about the proper role that a board has to occupy. And I think you're right that there are things that happen between board meetings. Board meetings have to be teed up properly. Follow through has to happen coming out of those board meetings. And that really puts a premium on having people, like you said, who have leadership on the board and help smooth out all those things I just mentioned, and having advisors and management who also help those things happen. So I think you're exactly right.
And that's why board committee chairs are so critical. I mean, imagine if audit and comp, couldn't work between the meetings. Those people in those positions are constantly working on issues in between their committee meetings. So, well, listen, this is obviously timely, and hopefully, there's people got something out in the way of setting some direction or making sure they take some of these steps at least to be a more effective board. So, Amy, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks again. Good to be here.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.